As late Congressman John Lewis lies in state at the Georgia state capitol today, people all over the country are reflecting on his impact and his contributions to fighting for the rights of minority groups, African Americans, the LGBTQ plus community, and many more. The push for equality certainly has been highlighted this summer by a number of minority groups, as reported in a recent Axios piece. This all comes as we're just 97 days away from the November election. So I want to bring in the author of that article, Stef Kight. Stef, you are a politics reporter for Axios. And I want to start off by asking you this. There's been some recent CBS News polling, as well as polling by other organizations, that shows that the support for the Black Lives Matter movement has continued to grow and has grown substantially. Black Lives Matter has been around since Trayvon Martin was killed, and we've certainly seen and heard from them every time there has been an incident that has brought this conversation about racial injustice back to the surface. But right now, for some reason, people are much more open to the message. Why is that?
It's a really good question, and one I don't think we will ever fully be able to answer because, of course, the poor treatment of minorities and African Americans in the U.S. has gone on for a very long time. But I think one of the key reasons why we've seen the Black Lives Matter gain the attention and the support that it has over the past few months is, of course, the George Floyd case and the clear picture of abuse that provided the whole world. I think it's very hard to argue when people are looking at those videos and that image of George Floyd with the officer's knee on his neck. And it goes back to that moment. I think that moment really captured the Americans' attention in a way that it hasn't been caught in a long time. And of course, I think you can also point to the coronavirus and people being on their phones more, maybe being at home more aware and watching the news. I think all of these things have really created this moment that we're seeing still play out with protests across the country calling for police reforms.
And Steph, you write that issues impacting other minority groups have also come to light during the pandemic and the protests. What did you learn, and what are some of those concerns you can share with the audience?
Absolutely. So I spoke to a few advocates for people with disabilities in the U.S. or immigrants in the U.S., Latino groups, and they're all looking at this moment as an opportunity to also push for the reforms that they think need to happen. They think that the energy behind the Black Lives Matter movement is something that they can support. And of course, they're supporting their Black brothers and sisters in the U.S., but they are also saying that we also have issues that need to be confronted. We are also marginalized in these ways. For example, the coronavirus has brought to light the issues around absentee voting. That's something that a lot of people with disabilities have been pushing for, easier access to absentee voting. And so the things going on in 2020, the coronavirus and these protests have really highlighted issues that impact various underrepresented groups in the U.S. Another example is the issue of police brutality. A lot of immigration advocates look at the rage against police brutality and say, we also need to address the brutality that's at place with ICE agents, that people should also be concerned about the way that law enforcement is carried out when it comes to immigration.
Of course, minority groups are not all the same. There are areas that certainly overlap within groups, but then, other concerns that are more specific, depending on the group that we are talking about. Can we sort of do a little bit of a compare and contrast thing? How the Republicans and the president have dealt with some of these minority group issues versus the Democrats and its leadership. I mean, I think it's frequent enough that we hear the president. He often doesn't miss an opportunity to at least talk about unemployment numbers when it comes to African Americans, or Hispanics when it comes to employment numbers. He's certainly aware of the fact that he needs to address some of these needs because he brings it up. But in terms of, how both parties have been dealing with these louder voices, what are you seeing?
I think it's interesting if you look at the Trump campaign. They clearly see that the demographics of the U.S. are changing. The demographics of the electorate are changing. They need to address that. You've seen him roll out various efforts specifically targeted to different minority groups. He has the Black Americans for Trump group and the Latino Americans for Trump group. And it's clear that he is playing this kind of politics, this kind of identity politics himself, identity politics that he has criticized the left of taking advantage of. So it is clear that the Trump administration sees this as something they have to speak to. As Axios has reported, Trump has looked at ways of addressing police reform, of course, in his own more Republican, more conservative way of doing things. But he does see the energy behind this, and he does know he has to address it. But at the same time, Trump has long been the law and order president. He has been very clear that he wants to maintain that image, even sending federal agents to Portland to tamp down on the protests that he sees as unruly and as getting out of hand. So that's a very different kind of action than we would expect to see from Democrats and people like Joe Biden, who have been much more vocal in their support for the issues that the Black Lives Matter group and other groups have been advocating for.
It's interesting, Steph, because as you know, of course, the conversation as we head into the elections has been around who a former vice president will choose as a running mate. And some of the names that have been discussed have different strengths and weaknesses, obviously. And, I wonder, given your reporting and others, for example, Susan Rice is often mentioned as a potential VP candidate, where she brings a lot of strengths in the foreign policy arena. But given all that we are going through, especially in 2020, these societal upheavals that we've seen over the past several months, it feels as if the electorate is more concerned about what's happening here in the United States and not as concerned about what strengths might be bolstered from a Biden candidacy with somebody with foreign policy experience. So I wonder if you're seeing a lot of these societal issues that have been unearthed during the pandemic having an impact on the ballot as we get closer to the election.
I certainly think if you look at 2020, that domestic issues are at front and center of most Americans' minds, especially when they'll be heading to the ballot box in November. We have a pandemic that has been worse in the U.S. than any other country. We have an economic collapse that will likely, last for a long time. We have civil unrest. So certainly, I think you're right that who Biden picks, people are going to be looking to as someone who cares about the issues impacting Americans at home right now and addressing the issues that we're seeing at the forefront. And so I think you're absolutely right, where, of course, foreign policy is an important element to any presidential campaign and platform. There are more pressing issues in the U.S. right now, and I think Americans are looking very closely at who Joe Biden decides to pick as his running mate to see how they are representative of the country. He has said that he's going to pick a woman, and lots of people are expecting it to be a minority woman to show more representation in the White House. And I think those things are going to matter even more this year than in past years.
Stef Kight at Axios. Excellent reporting, Steph. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.